So thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you decided the first speech of the proposition, you remain with one idea, that we somehow need a bigger structure that will somehow lead to a bigger amount of responsibility, to a bigger amount of credibility, and to a bigger amount of efficiency. Team proposition doesn't even try to show us how this happens, so they fail. Us and team opposition say that bigger is not always better. And for sustaining our ideas, we'll have two big constructive points. I'm going to talk about the sovereignty of a state, while my colleague will develop our case talking about the backlash of the implementation. But firstly, I'll have three points of contention. Firstly, I'll analyze their model and show you why this committee is not so good as it seems to be. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the local governments. Are they biased and corrupt? And thirdly, I'm going to look at the impact of the motion. But first, let's look at their model. They don't even explain how this committee will be elected, because we say that if it's composed of members from different countries, the people from the USA or from Russia or from developed countries with a big amount of power, those will be the countries that will rule, and those will be the countries that will have enough power to make research in smaller countries not to exist anymore. We consider that those are the people that will be biased, not the local governments. Secondly, on the first proposition, they tell us that even actual laws are not respected, that even the signatory parties don't respect those laws. But they don't tell us how will the people respect this international committee if even the basic laws are not respected by the signatory parties. The third problem, is that science is composed from many branches. We have lots of things that happen in the research area. What happens is that every branch will have a scientific representation. Will this committee be as proficient as team proposition tells us it will be? We consider that it's quite impossible to have experts in every domain, and if in branch X there is some potentially risky research, but in the committee there isn't an expert in this area, the committee will have no power in preventing anything. And it shows us that this committee is not as good as team proposition wants us to believe. Another problem is what means a controversy, because team proposition doesn't really give us any examples, doesn't give us any domains in which controversial research exists. They don't even tell us how we'll decide that specific research is controversial, or how will we decide that it is not. This might lead to a lot of biased things, because is the decision of this committee mandatory? If it is not, the committee is not efficient, it is useless. And if it is mandatory, how will this thing implement? What will happen to countries that do not respect the decisions? The biggest problem still is that as I said before, if a big country with huge power wants to stop a country that is a natural foe of that country, like the USA wants to stop the power of Iran, they will not permit them to make any research. The big question that arises is, who watches the watchmen? Now, my second point about the local government. They tell us that the local government is not so interested. What we say is that the local government is extremely interested, because if something goes wrong, the politicians are the ones who will not be elected in the next term. The politicians are firstly the ones who suffer, and that's why they put the best scientists in the country, in the local domain, that will look after what happens. Secondly, countries invest money in this kind of research. That means they invest money for something to happen. They want results. They don't want only do research for the love of research. They do research because they need things to happen. They want the results. They want development of that country. That's the reason why we research some things. Thirdly, what we see is that even if the problem might become global, the first country that is affected by the problem is the country in which the research takes place. That means that in the moment in which something really goes bad, like happened to Fukushima in Japan, Japan was the country affected. This means that the scientists and the governments will always look carefully at what happens, because they're in danger of dying. Every people in that country, they're the first ones who suffer. Now, thirdly, looking at the impact of the motion, we see they don't really give us any disadvantages of today's SQ. They don't really show us what happens today if local research goes wrong, or even if it happened, because they don't given us any examples of things that extended globally. They also don't really show us good positive effects of implementing this motion. The only thing that we see is that it will be more transparent. But we say that the research is not transparent not because there is no international committee. Research is not transparent because people do not understand science. Because science is hard to understand, and just by creating another committee, another entity, won't make science easier to understand. That's why transparency will not become higher, and I ask the next speaker of the proposition to tell us how the transparency will increase. Now, what we say is also that the research will get slower and slower because every time something happens, you'll have to talk with this committee, you'll have to show him it's okay, and if they tell you it's not okay, they don't really have to give you reasons why it is not okay. Therefore, the research will be slowed, if not stopped. This leads to science that will hide the research, and this will lead to even less transparency. This is what results, not a higher amount of transparency, but even lesser transparency, which is not okay. Now, my first constructive point refers to sovereignty. What we say is that if you invest, you control. Why? Because in the moment in which you start research and things like this, you assume both two big things. Firstly, you assume the positive results, but secondly, you also assume the consequences. You're the first one who assumes them, and if in the moment in which you give the money, you are the owner of the research, are the owner of both the results and both the consequences. It is unfair for others to intervene. Why? Because they might intervene biased, as I shown you before, but also they might steal your results, because this committee won't always look after the consequences, but will look also inevitably after the results. And the results further help a local country to develop, but also help the humanity to develop. And in the moment in which you lose your sovereignty, you lose the power to develop your country in concordance with the humanity. And this is wrong. Well, let's look at the end of the day what happens. At the end of the day, Team Proposition proposed a thing that is not realistic, because they don't really show us what that committee will be, what will happen, why it is not biased, why it is so efficient, and they do not explain what really happens in the moment in which this committee is formed. Also, we realize that the local governments are never interested in being corrupt in research that has potential of being risky, and also that affecting sovereignty has a direct impact to that country, and further impacts humanity and the development of humanity. That's why at the end of the day, we ask Team Proposition not to look just for bigger, but looking for better, and they need to respond to our question: who watches the watchman? Thank you.